Good evening. I'm Alan Price, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. And on behalf of all my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are here with us tonight, in person, online, and in the theaters just down the hall. Welcome. To open, I humbly start with a land acknowledgement to recognize that the land on which we stand was once stewarded by indigenous peoples. While a land acknowledgement by itself is not enough, it is an important way to promote indigenous visibility, and it serves as a reminder that we are on stolen and settled indigenous land. And I invite all of us to contemplate how to better support indigenous communities and to learn how to honor and take care of the land that each of us inhabits. Thank you. Tonight's program is presented as part of the Kennedy Library Forum series, and I'd like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and CVS Health, as well as the Mass Cultural Council, and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. This program is supported in part by the James M. and Kathleen D. Stone Foundation. We are so grateful to have this timely opportunity to explore and interpret the results of this year's extraordinary elections with our distinguished guests. I'm now honored to introduce tonight's speakers. I'm so pleased to welcome Margery Eagan back to the library this evening. As so many of you know, she is the co-host of 89.7 GBH's midday program, Boston Public Radio, which she has co-hosted with her Boston Public Radio co-host, Jim Braude, for many years, first doing a TV show together at NECN and then a radio show at WTKK before moving to GBH in 2013. She has also written for many publications during her distinguished career. She served as a longtime columnist at the Boston Herald, was also the Catholic spirituality columnist for the Boston Globe's website, Crux Now. I'm also delighted to welcome Heather Cox Richardson back to the Kennedy Library. A professor of history at Boston College, she has written about the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, and the American West in award-winning books whose subjects stretch from European settlement of the North American continent to the history of the Republican Party through the Trump administration. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Guardian, among other outlets. She is also the author of The Letters from an American newsletter on Substack. And I'm so glad to welcome our moderator for this evening back to the library. Eileen McNamara is professor. Eileen McNamara is professor emerita of the practice of journalism at Brandeis University and an award-winning former reporter and columnist for the Boston Globe, where she won an individual Pulitzer Prize for commentary and contributed to the newspaper's Pulitzer Prize-winning coverage of the clergy sex abuse scandal in the Archdiocese of Boston. She is also the author of Eunice, the Kennedy Who Changed the World. Her writing continues to appear on Cognoscenti, the commentary pages of WBUR.org. Please join me in welcoming tonight's special guests.
Well, it's a pleasure to see you all. I thought you'd still be under your covers. It's wonderful to be here with these two extraordinary women to talk about what happened last Tuesday and what it means for us going forward. So I thought that I would start with like an easy question for the both of you.
You just know what's coming, right?
Yeah. So how does the sitting vice president get defeated by a convicted felon?
Well, for a simple question, I'll give you a simple answer. And the first answer I would give you is disinformation. You know, we know that people who understood what was happening in the world had a fact-based vision of immigration, the economy, the border, all voted about 3-1 for Harris, whereas people who did not know what was happening and were misinformed about those issues voted 2-1 for Trump. And those are numbers we can't look away from.
Margery, do you want to tackle that?
I think disinformation was huge. We get, on the radio, I get texts, hundreds of texts every day about the, when we're talking about politics. And just today I got one about how Kamala Harris couldn't speak without a teleprompter, and she told all these lies, and she never gave long interviews. And you're thinking, where are these people? Where do these people get this information? But I think that we've talked about this a lot among my colleagues. The mainstream media, so-called, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, even Fox, they were undermined, I think, in this cleverly by Trump, by going to podcasts and not doing interviews at all, this so-called manosphere. Right. Joe Rogan has been talked a lot about. Trump did an interview with Joe Rogan, which was listened to 46 million times. And Joe Rogan doesn't do any follow-up questions. I listened to that interview, and Trump said all sorts of things that weren't true, and Rogan never corrected him.
Never challenged him. So the mainstream media did correct him. Whenever he said something that was false, you could read on the front page of any newspaper or watch the network news and see that he said something that wasn't true. But a lot of America isn't reading those newspapers, are they?
That's right.
Well, for one thing, there aren't as many as there used to be. And what do we do about this level of misinformation in a media climate where people are in their particular silos? So you're watching Fox, or you're watching One America or Newsmax, and you're getting basically right-wing talking points. You're not really getting news. How do we break through that? If that's what we've concluded is one of the biggest issues that we're facing. You wanted to?
Well, I've been told a million times it's impossible to do this, but as you know, being a newspaper reporter or even being on television, Fox was sued for almost $1 billion for lying about the election. They did have to pay that. But if you made a mistake as a newspaper reporter and you libel someone, you slander someone, you got sued. I mean, I spent 2 days in the witness stand when I had the wrong guy peeing on the lawn of Everett High School when I was a reporter. It was a father-son thing. It was a second junior versus the third. But I mean, I made that mistake. I made a mistake not intentionally. Mm-hmm. I goofed it up, but we got sued. Right. And the fact that you can just say whatever you want online and have these algorithms so geared to people, whether it's Facebook or X or whatever, it's a problem. I don't know how to fix it, but I don't understand why in those sites you can say whatever the hell you want to and get away with it with no repercussions.
Well, we just had a Republican candidate for the president who stood up on a podium like that one, wherever he was, and said things that were patently untrue. And he seems to have gotten away with it. I mean, he won the popular vote.
Well, that's interesting, though, because a lot of what drove this election actually started in the right wing. Started in right-wing media, the cats and eating cats and dogs thing, all those things actually started in the memes, and he picked them up. Mm-hmm. And he often picked them up through J.D. Vance. And, one of the things about this moment that I think is really interesting is that we are watching a number of our institutions collapse, or maybe be reborn in different forms. So the media, for sure, we've got the legacy media that has its own issues. It's got its capitalization issues. It's got, the way it operates as an issue. We have all that going on, but then we have all these new media, and new media that are driven not only by the memes and the lies, but also by algorithms that privilege certain kinds of information. And you can see it for those of you who have watched the exodus from Twitter, in the last week to Blue Sky, which has its own issues. The engagement at Blue Sky of accounts that are not associated with the right wing is 7 times that of X because of a different algorithm. And that seems to me something that we could handle as a society. In the short term, with the Republicans in control of the White House, the Senate, and possibly the House, and certainly the Supreme Court, I think if we are going to rebuild this, we're going to have to do it ourselves. And we're going to have to do it by taking back those spaces that the radical right has monopolized. YouTube is the primary radicalizer of young men. Reddit and X are the three that young men are on. Young women are on TikTok, which is not as radical. And there really are very few reality-based voices on, especially on YouTube and on X. There are more on Reddit. The number one trending issue on Reddit today was leopards eating faces party. So there is, in fact, some pushback on Reddit. But I think we're just going to have to go and populate those places.
Well,
everybody go home right now and open an account on Reddit, okay?
I mean, it is, it's a great idea to think that we can take it back, you know, that if we all just went out and got accounts on Reddit, that it would make the difference. But Elon Musk runs X.
Yeah.
And we've got a big billionaire problem here, don't we? Vance is a creature of Peter Thiel. Elon Musk is apparently going to cut a couple of $1 trillion out of the federal government. I'm not quite sure how that's going to work. But the influence of these guys that are monopolizing what is now the new media, that's a pretty powerful force for us little Reddit subscribers to take on, isn't it? How do we do it?
I don't think Elon and Donald are going to last too long together. Those are two men with very large egos. I think that you already saw Donald pushing Elon off the stage the other night when they were at some event, so I don't know how long that's going to last. But, you know, besides the misinformation thing, though, I mean, the Democrats always get trashed for trashing what they did. But there is some trashing here of how this all came down. When you talk about, we had this guy, first of all, we should say that a majority of white women voted for Donald Trump this time. They voted for him in 2020. They voted for him in 2016. I often find that rather depressing, especially since he's been adjudicated libelous for what would be called rape in Massachusetts. It was not in New York, but it was close. And he's, I don't, was it 24 other women have accused him? So, and some of these women, I think, knew perfectly well what they were doing because they split tickets in the 10 states that had the abortion on the ballot. I think 7 of the 10 states, they divided. They went for Trump, and they also went for abortion rights. But we had this Mike Madrid on the radio, who has written this book called The Latino Century, and he was talking about, you know, the Latino vote, which swung significantly toward Trump. Even in my hometown of Fall River, which has never voted for a Republican before, voted for Trump this year. And he talked about, all people cared about was the price of eggs, the price, you know, the cost of the rent. They were very upset about immigration, even though they were first, second, third generation Latinos themselves. I mean, it's not a monolith, all these different countries, but that's what mattered to them. And that the Democrats were much too slow to realize what a big deal that was among in working class neighborhoods where a lot of the migrant people that came from other countries wound up.
I can see you're going to take exception to that.
Well, just, I think we need to put a few caveats around it. First, the fact that down ballot races went progressive. So there's clearly something different between the top of the ticket and the down ballot races. And I think it's significant that white women north of, in the north, vote Democratic by about 4 points, and in the south, vote Republican by, I think it's 23 points. Yeah. And that's a really important distinction, because when you lump together all white women, there's a really big difference between northern white women and southern white women. That's not to say that northern white women are angels about everything, but it does speak to the media landscape and the long-term generational images of patriarchy and how they have been propagated throughout our history.
How about the role of religion in that different dynamic between the North and the South?
Well, we don't have final numbers yet, but it appears that 22% of the Trump voters were self-described white evangelicals.
Yeah.
Again, these have not been checked yet. These are exit polls, and they are notoriously unreliable. 87% of them voted for Trump. So if you get them out of the electorate, Harris and Walz win by 20 points.
And also those ads that ran about the fear of some women of going into the, sneaking into the voting booth to vote for Harris because they didn't want to tell their husbands that they were, there was an interview with a woman whose husband was a Trump voter. He's in the shower, so she's out in the backyard talking to the reporter about how she's going to vote for Harris, but she didn't want to tell her husband because she didn't want to have an argument with him. Or, there was a lot of religious complaining about how you were going against your religion if your husband said vote this way and you either lied about it or didn't vote the way he voted. I mean, that sounded so crazy.
Did you see Newt Gingrich on that? Did anybody see this? There are these ads about your husband doesn't have to know how you vote.
Yes.
And Newt Gingrich went out and said, this is attacking the
sanctity of marriage.
Yeah.
A fine one to discuss the sanctity of marriage.
How could you keep a secret from your spouse? And you're thinking, dude, if you don't know, Newt Gingrich was infamous for marrying his mistresses serially. So apparently he kept a number of secrets from his spouse. But I guess it's okay if you're cheating on them. I don't know.
Didn't he bring one of the spouse's divorce papers when she was lying in the hospital
yes,
bed recovering
she
from?
was suffering from cancer at the time.
That's right.
But I was like, really? Of all people who have earned the right to keep your mouth shut, you are top of the list.
So, you mentioned the ads, these advertisements, so maybe that was a strategic mistake, those ads, Julia Roberts or whoever it was intoning about sneaking around behind your husband's back.
I don't know.
But look at some of those other despicable ads about trans rights. They were simply designed to terrify people about what is not an enormous phenomenon that happens in the culture. It put me, and I'm sure most people, in mind of the Willie Horton ad that we saw in 1988 against Michael Dukakis. That in that case, we were afraid of the scary black man who was going to get out of prison during a furlough. And now we're supposed to be terrified of trans children. Why does it work?
$213 million into anti-trans ads from the GOP, which was their highest concentrated investment. And one of the things, and this is a place I do think the Democrats fell down, is that one of the things that they have not articulated well is that rights are not a zero-sum game. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the way that Lincoln, for example, articulated the importance of guaranteeing human rights as they were discussed in principle in the Declaration of Independence, is that once you start to say, I have rights but you don't, you have admitted the principle that you have a society in which some people are better than others. And from there, it is a very quick trip to we should be ruled by one person or by a very small group, and all the rest of us can do is hope that we are not in that group of people who is defined as those without rights. And that's something that, people just don't articulate. They're like, we have to give people rights, as if it's, you can have an extra cookie, when it's really about the fundamental principle of a society in which nobody is better than anybody else and has to answer to the law on equal terms. And that's something I just don't think that we articulate enough.
Well, I guess the sad but obvious follow-up question to me is, have we moved in that direction? That we do not believe that everybody is equal and that not everybody should have the same rights. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned earlier when we first met is this purely a political issue that we're facing, or is this a really cultural shift that we're seeing, where we don't define ourselves as Americans the way you just did, the way Lincoln did?
Well, the trans ads were on every NFL game, I think, for
Yeah.
weeks and weeks and weeks. Harris took some criticism for not answering those, not pointing out enough that the stuff about surgery in prisons was there in the Trump administration as well. It wasn't something that she came up with. It was there in the Trump administration.
It probably wouldn't have worked because Michael Dukakis got pilloried for letting Willie Horton out on a furlough, and Ronald Reagan had done the same thing in California.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of that, I guess, isn't there?
Yeah.
You know, projecting onto the other person what you of yourself have done. But, I mean, you have Bernie Sanders, who's saying that the Democrats are too involved in identity politics. You've had Seth Moulton, who's taking a lot of grief for saying that he didn't want his young daughters growing up and getting run over, I think is the way he put it.
I believe run over was the phrase.
Run
by,
over.
by some trans athlete.
But your former colleague, Joan Venaki, said in the Globe today, I would call her a liberal viewer of these things, basically said that Seth Moulton had a point, that we have to be able to talk to these things, and maybe it's something that if you're older and you need to have someone explain to you a little bit better than we explained. I don't know.
Well,
because it worked.
I'm going to push back on the identity politics thing because Harris and Walz went out of their way not to embrace identity politics. And, you know, if you think about at the DNC, when everybody was wearing the white suits to honor the suffragists, and she showed up to accept the nomination in a black suit. I mean, that was, and there was not a speech that talked about her as the first woman in office or anything like that. They deliberately ran away from that, and I would suggest that the Republicans were going to find something to hit the Democrats on no matter what it was. They went after John Kerry for his war service, for God's sake, right? Yeah. And so that was going to happen no matter what. But I think that, you know, personally, I look at the way we run politics now, and I think that you have to look at 1960 as one does, right? For a number of reasons, one of which is that it was in 1960 that we first get political scientists articulating the idea that we all agree about democracy, we all agree about a government that regulates business and provides a basic social safety net and promotes infrastructure and protects civil rights. So stop talking about democracy, stop talking about that stuff, we all agree. Right. Instead, you want to put together constituencies and explain why certain constituencies are better than others. And once we get that, we lose from both the traditional Republicans and the traditional Democrats an attempt to tell a national story. Mm-hmm. And that leaves room for this wedge group, the movement conservatives at the time, but they have become the MAGA Republicans, to say, you want to hear a story about America? I'll tell you a story about America. It's a little guy who's fighting off this behemoth socialist government that wants to take money and to give it to black people first, but also women, just like you're going to see in Star Wars with Luke Skywalker against the Empire. And this is really what it means to be an American. And I think that's really what decimated both the traditional Republicans, because these MAGA people are not traditional Republicans, and the Democrats, because they're not telling stories that make people feel like they're an American and that their vote matters.
Well, so can I ask you both this question then? Doesn't this problem exist not just because in 1960 we all agreed on something? This is generational, right? You have to repeat the story in order for it to be a continuing story. Do we have an education problem in this country?
Yes.
Part of our, we've all, yeah. Part of our problem is that we've identified misinformation as a big factor in this election. Are we not teaching young people how to identify a fact from a fantasy? Are we not teaching civics? We're not teaching media literacy. We can all get a Reddit account and we can try to fight from within, but it would be nice if our students could read Reddit and figure out what's nonsense and what isn't. That they could at least figure out what's the origin of this amazingly horrible story I've read that may or not be true.
Our students are getting that. The youngest generation knows how to do that. The people who went for Trump are the ones right below the baby boomers. Mm-hmm. I can never remember if it's X or G or Z or whatever it is, but they're the ones who swallow everything. So our students are at least getting media literacy. Civics is another question.
Right.
You know, we just came down from the president's room upstairs.
Yeah.
We were all up there looking at pictures of JFK and Jackie Kennedy and the whole Kennedy family.
And Eunice, don't forget Eunice.
That's right,
Yes,
Eunice,
they were looking at
about
you.
whom you wrote a wonderful book about how
yeah.
her father didn't want her to do anything, and she was really the genius of the family. It's a great book if you haven't read it, by Eileen McNamara. But I just thought, look at these pictures on the wall. How did this happen that we've kind of come to this, that, as you called it, such an aspirational time when people were so, I think I did, and probably you did, growing up, thinking that we would make a lot of mistakes in the United States, but eventually, we were in good hands, and the government would do the right thing, and people, the best and the brightest, we used to call them in the Kennedy years, were sort of going to lead us. And that's one of the saddest things about now, is that I look at people like Stephen Miller, who's going to be organizing mass deportation, and Kristi Noem, who shot her puppy, her 14-month-old puppy. She's going to be involved in Health and Human Services. And
Homeland Security.
Homeland Security, I'm sorry.
Right.
And that Tom Honan guy, who's also going to be involved in deportation, and he was asked by a reporter, well, what about the family separation thing? He said, well...
He was one of the architects of family separation.
And he was so cruel. And that's part of this whole regime. It's a very cruel regime. He just said, well, we'll deport them all together, the kids and the parents. We'll just deport them all together. Like, in such a cruel, heartless way, I thought, wow.
Well, that, I think, is what I was trying to get at when I was talking about whether this is a cultural shift as well as just the results of a particular election. We're a meaner country than we used to be, and you might not agree with that. And I would add about identity politics. Yes, they did run away with it away from it in terms of she wasn't running as a black woman or a black Asian woman. She was not an Indian woman. She was not doing that. But she's a black woman. You can't run away from being a black woman. And how much of that was really a factor? If we're meaner, we're pretty racist and we're pretty sexist in this country too.
Well, yes.
That's a story that we don't want to tell about ourselves, but maybe that's a story after this election that we have to face about ourselves.
Well, I'm going to suggest, though, that politics has shaped that reality, because we were a harsher country in many ways in the 1950s, and we went the other way, right? Mm-hmm. It was a group of largely white men who voted to do things like put in place the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So it is possible to shape a polity that goes another way, but one of the things that is so incredibly important about where we are right now, I think, is that with the Reagan Revolution and the arrival of neoliberalism in 1981, the neoliberalism was never popular. And it was very clear by 1986, after Reagan had won in 84, that by 86 there was a landslide of Democrats into the House and the Senate, and they recognized that in order to maintain the kind of power that they wanted to, they were going to have to continue to divide the American people, to put in voter suppression laws, which they began in 1986, to stack the courts, which they began in 1986, and to really hammer on the idea that there were good Americans who stood against those people. And those people were black, they were brown, and by 1970, under Richard Nixon, they had also become women. And those were people who wanted a handout from the federal government, who were taking tax dollars from hardworking white people.
Welfare queens, as Reagan said.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that idea that in order to maintain power for a minority of people in the United States, in order to do things like cut regulation and cut taxes and slash the social safety net, they had to turn Americans against each other, was very much part of a political playbook, and still is. And one of the interesting things, as we've all been sitting here trying to figure out and trying to think our way through where we are in this moment since last week, one of the things that I have thought a lot about is that the way that one of the things that the Democrats have tried never to do since the rise of neoliberalism is they have always talked about getting along with everybody, making it work, compromising, negotiating. The way you garner power is by having an enemy. And one of the things that fascinates me in this moment is that we just had I don't quite know what to do with this, but we just had an American election won by the injection of more than $132 million in cash alone, let alone the help through things like X, by the richest man in the world, who is now sitting next to the president-elect, not the vice president, but the vice president-elect, but he is sitting next to the president-elect, choosing who's going into office, coming up with policies, and so on. And I'm a little shocked that nobody is saying, folks, we have a rich people problem here.
Yeah. I mean, we do have a rich people problem. We have a rich people problem in terms of that and in terms of the amount of money in politics, which is just kind of insane. And we didn't really talk in this election much about the whole income inequality issue either.
No, which is crazy.
Yeah, which is what, again, I think a lot of people that were talking about why they voted for Trump were saying they can't afford the groceries, they can't pay the rent, they can't buy a house. We've all been a little late to the housing issue. You know, we maybe thought it was just a big deal in Boston. It's a big deal everywhere. And the sense that we're not addressing those issues for people that are really struggling.
Well, but I'm going to go back to the media on this one because I read a whole bunch of things the day after the election that said, you know, the Democrats should have gone away from neoliberalism. They should have pushed back against that. And I'm thinking, did you miss the Biden administration?
Well, you put this in your column. You listed everything that he did that was great for the working class that nobody seems to know about.
Well, that's, I mean, it just floored me. And there was actually, I'm not going to identify this reporter. It was not a Boston reporter. Somebody who was an economics reporter who said, you know, he should have helped the lower and middle classes better. And I'm like, have you read a single chart, you know? And it just never computed with all sorts of people who are now like, that was a problem.
That's an enormous problem. I mean, but did the Democratic ticket have a problem articulating it?
Yes.
You
think so.
say yes, but
Yes.
it seemed to me, every time I heard them speak, they talked about the infrastructure bill, they talked about chips, whatever they are, something computer-wise, but where factories are being built in this country. That was all Biden. But Biden didn't put his, when you drive down the expressway to see a construction problem, it says the bipartisan infrastructure bill.
Because they were trying to build that middle.
They were.
But did you see this morning that the CEO of ExxonMobil, Darren Woods,
Yes.
Came out and said, please don't interrupt the climate change initiatives under the Biden administration.
Right.
And so have a number of Republicans saying, we actually really like all the money that's come in. And Woods pointed out last year in April of 2023 that ExxonMobil has invested so heavily in carbon capture that it expects that its carbon capture business is going to be more valuable in 10 years than its oil and gas part of the business. And I'm thinking, that would have been a freaking good piece of information
Before the
8 days
election.
ago, right?
Before the election. I didn't hear in that statement today, though, that they all want to swear off drilling in the Arctic wildlife area.
We're going to be drilling on January 20th. I think that's going to start happening right away, which is one of the things that so upsets me about this election, my fear about what's going to happen to the climate initiatives. Even though, as you say, I mean, Biden has put in a lot of these good green jobs in Republican and red states, and I think it would be difficult for them to take those away. But I am
He just put somebody in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency who doesn't believe in environmental protection.
Who's terrible. That Zeldin guy, the congressman from New York,
Right.
yeah, he's going to run the EPA. That should be good.
Right.
And then we have, of course, the Supreme Court that wants to make the EPA and a lot of these regulatory agencies even less able to regulate, which is another scary problem. But RFK is going to take care of the food. He's going to take care of the bad,
Sorry, Bobby.
the preservatives in the food.
Well, that's terrifying. I mean, you've got a fellow who was a pretty marginal fringe person for the last, 30 years of his life. And I don't personally think that he's going to put him in charge of Health and Human Services.
Think so either.
I think he used him and he's Trump's clever and he captured his supporters. But I don't think even Trump is going to put
No.
Kennedy in charges.
Apparently, he didn't put the whale on the top, whale head on the top of the car. That was a story that he, in addition to having the little dead bear
The
that he
little
put in
dead
Central
bear.
Park.
Oh, I wonder if he hit that bear. I do. I don't know if he
kind
found
of
it on the
suspicious.
side of the road.
But we were all excited about the whale for a while until he
Yeah.
supposedly chopped it off on the beach and then put it on top of the car. And his poor children were in the car. The insides of the whale head were dripping down.
Yeah.
But apparently, the investigation discovered that that was not really the case.
No. It put the story about Romney and Seamus,
That's
the
right.
golden retriever
That's
that was
right.
on the roof of the car.
That's right.
Going on vacation to bed forever. Nobody's going to beat the whale on top of the roof.
Well, so one of the things, though, to think about right now is I'm not convinced that all of these appointments will actually materialize. I mean, I think what I'm seeing right now is an attempt on the part of the MAGA Republicans to solidify their power in the House and the Senate. And that's going to involve a lot of jockeying around, offering people positions that they may or may not be forced to take and they can be fired from. So what really made me think about this is the appointment of, or the suggestion that he was going to send Elise Stefanik to become the U.S. ambassador to the UN.
Right.
That's kind of an insult if you think about it. She's the third ranking Republican in the House. It's a very powerful position.
Right.
And he's going to move her to the ambassadorship of an organization he doesn't care about.
Right.
So he's essentially pulling her out of the position of power in the House and tossing her into the alley. And there's
an
a lot of that.
organization that she has publicly and frequently said should be disbanded.
Right. So maybe there's more to it than that, but right now I'm not convinced of which is real and which is not. And one of the things about Zeldin at the EPA is that you can scream drill baby drill all you want, but there are plenty of permits that are already in people's hands that they're not drilling because oil is so cheap right now.
Yeah.
You would lose money, and it's a lot of money to get drilling up and going. So the idea that somehow this is going to, I mean, it just doesn't make any economic sense to collect more permits. I mean, I think what we're really going to be seeing with Zeldin there is the trashing of the regulations that we currently have.
Yeah.
Well, he opposes the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act.
Right, government overreach, right?
Right, government
which
overreach.
is
It
the whole,
is.
yeah.
We don't want that. We don't
No.
want clean air and clean water.
No, we don't.
No, we don't.
We don't need that. What do you need that for? Well, nobody's come back to the question that I asked
What?
about sexism and
Oh,
racism.
she had the double whammy. Absolutely. She's a woman, and she's a black South Asian woman. She had the double whammy going there, even though she never
Was it
talked
foolish?
about it.
Was it foolish to think that that was going to happen in 2024? That we would elect a woman, a black woman, to be president of the United States?
You know what I think? I think she didn't have enough time. This is, a million people have said this, so Margery, why don't you say it one more time?
Right.
Biden should not have run again. He said he was going to be a transitional president. When he announced he was running again, there was a lot of horror about it. And for many months, people were saying in polls that they were concerned about his age. We didn't have what might have made a difference. I mean, I thought she did a great job.
Right.
She was a very charismatic character. She did wonderfully talking about abortion very passionately. She did a lot of great interviews. She was great on Saturday Night Live talking about Kamala, Mamala, Pajamala, and all that kind of stuff. She cleaned his clock in the debate, but she didn't have a chance. I remember seeing Barack Obama when he first was debating, when all those Democrats were there. He wasn't very good,
Right.
but he got better and better and
Right.
better. She didn't have a chance to debate in a kind of primary with Gretchen Whitmer or Newsom from California or even Andy Bashir from
There
Kentucky.
were Democrats who asked that there
Yeah.
be a primary, even in this abbreviated window
It
that
would have
we had.
helped. It would have helped. Because I think sometimes when she get asked about the economy, she started talking about her middle-class upbringing instead of kind of explaining how inflation, after the pandemic, and it came back down, and we didn't have a big recession, and every place in the world has terrible recession. She didn't explain it. She had a tough time with that question, and I don't think she had time to really get her skills if she'd been combating with other candidates.
It's so stunning, though, to hear us critique her in this way, and I've read what you've read that has critiqued her in this way. When the selection was won by a man whose inarticulate.
He's got
and-
tapioca for brains at this point.
Yeah, it's true.
Well, there's a little candid assessment for you.
No, I mean, he's clearly, the idea that Biden's age was a problem and his was not speaks to the fact that neither was an accurate critique, right? Because Biden, while he looked bad at that debate, was, of course, negotiating one of the most important and complicated hostage deals we have ever made.
The same day.
Yeah, same day. And he'd been flying all over the world. And then Trump is there and, doing the weave, right?
Yeah.
But one of the reasons that I think that Biden stayed in and that it made sense for him to stay in, and this is an institutional problem, is that the reason it was Biden and Harris in 2020 was because they were the only two people who could nail that constituency together. They had two totally separate constituencies. And my concern about Biden dropping out was that if you replaced him with somebody else and tried to keep her on as the vice president to keep her constituency, you were going to lose her key constituencies, which were black and brown people and women, who were going to be really angry. And if you moved her up, you had the problem that you identified, that a lot of people were not willing to vote for a woman of color. And so she tried to square that circle by bringing aboard Tim Walz, which I thought was ideologically fascinating because he is known as a Democrat and a progressive Democrat in Minnesota, but his way of speaking and acting about politics is Republican. He is an early 20th century Republican. So ideologically, I thought that was fascinating, but it was not. She did not manage to recreate that coalition that she and Biden did. And I'm not sure, if you think about the other options, people talk about Gavin Newsom. He's fabulous in California. I don't think that would have played well on the national scale because his skeletons are large. Yeah. The obvious answer, I think, was J.B. Pritzker. But then you still, even if you put Pritzker up there, who would have been a great foil because he's the heir to the Hyatt fortune, and that's actually a successful hotel company. And he actually has the cash, and he actually knows how to govern, and I understand he's a hell of a nice guy. It would have been a really nice comparison.
He did make that point at one point, saying, I'm a real billionaire.
That's right. That's right.
That's right, he did. Yeah. But I don't know what you would have done then with K-Hive, Kamala Harris's people. I mean, it was a dilemma, and a lot of us spent a lot of time trying to figure this one out. And
did she lose the election when she went on The View, and they asked her if she could name anything that she disagreed with Joe Biden?
Come on, I don't think she lost the election. I think she was running against. I think she did a great job. By the way, I think she used new media, but I think. How are you going to compete when you have 48% of Americans who live in an alternative reality that think, as you said, that she can't put a sentence together when she's actually a brilliant woman?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, how do you run against that when the institutions are against you?
When she was in the Senate going after Justice Kavanaugh, it was so wonderful. I mean, she was great, right at him. I don't know any laws that regulate what men can do with their bodies, and he couldn't answer. And she was terrific. And obviously in that debate, I mean, how could you think she couldn't talk if you saw that debate?
Because they didn't see the debate.
They didn't see the debate.
They didn't see the debate, and they didn't read the mainstream media. They didn't read real assessments of her. But there was a little bit of naivete. I mean, she was in an impossible position in the sense that she's Biden's vice president. Of course she's going to agree with his policies. He sets the policies. She doesn't. But to make that statement, I can't think of a single thing that I disagree with Joe Biden on when his approval rating was in the toilet.
But look at the economy. What were you going to say? I'm going to take the most successful economy since the 1960s and change it? And she did. She did, by the way.
Donald Trump convinced the American people that the economy that is booming is in terrible shape.
Well, it's going to be great on January 21st,
Right.
2025, you know, when all of a sudden it's going to be, oh, look, things are great. But again, how do you fight back against that? This is literally the best economy we've had since the 1960s, in more than 60 years. If you're in the bottom 80% of the economy, your real wages increased faster than inflation. The top 20%, the opposite was true. So we had more wage compression and income compression than we've had in our history since 1980. We've got new manufacturing came back to the country. We have the lowest unemployment rate. I mean, what are you going to say? It's so good, I got to change it? I mean, she did
But see,
say...
I think millions of people didn't feel that. I really don't. I think they couldn't afford their rent. They couldn't afford to go to college. They couldn't afford to pay their student loans. They couldn't afford the groceries. There are all these people, you know, at the beginning of Trump's term, he, of course, inherited the Obama economy.
Yeah.
Then he was smart enough, all those checks that went out in the COVID pandemic,
That
they
he
came
signed
from
them.
Donald Trump. And there was the child care tax credit, there was that extra money to people, and then it went away. And so if you're living in two different worlds and you're not reading all this stuff, you just feel your own inability to pay the bills. It was easier, and I think people believe that, when Trump was there at the beginning. Even though you're right, I mean, Biden's done a lot of stuff for the middle class, but you look at, in Boston, I mean, we're very expensive, but even around the country, people can't afford to live in too many...
But again, I guess to ask the education question again, because I'm not sure that all of the American people understand that there are three branches of government, and that there's local municipal government and the state government, and they all have a different function. The president doesn't actually set the price of eggs.
No, he does not. It has nothing to do with inflation.
And I understand that what you're saying is that people don't vote on the, you know, whatever Paul Krugman writes in the New York Times about the state of the economy doesn't resonate with most people because they really care about their own situation. They wake up in the morning and think, how am I going to pay the gas bill today? It isn't that the Democrats aren't addressing that issue, it's that somehow the public didn't feel that they were addressing that
But you know,
issues.
right here in Boston, right,
Yeah.
we're a very progressive state. Mayor of Boston, Michelle Wu, has been trying to get some reasonable, she doesn't call it rent control,
Right.
but some control on rent going through the roof around here. It's ridiculous.
Right.
But she can't get it because the legislature won't approve. What the legislature has to do with rent in Boston, I don't know, but that's the rule, right? They
That's
have to
the
approve.
law, yeah.
That's the law. So she can't get it. And you look, there's 15 or 20 legislators that are real estate magnates
Right.
owning 15 and $20 million worth of real estate. I'm exaggerating, but not totally. So right here, it's a crisis, it's a mess, and we haven't really done anything about it. You know, when you talk to young people in Boston, and we're not unique, they can't afford anything.
Right.
And they're people that went to college and thought they were going to have good careers. So if you didn't go to college, and that's the other education divide, right?
Right.
This election was about the college educated and the non-college educated. If you didn't go to college and you're in the Midwest or wherever you are, I do think those economic stresses are real, and I don't think we've figured out how to fix them, and we didn't talk about income inequality.
Well, but again, Harris had a proposal, a series of proposals to address that.
Right.
You know, 3 million new housing units, the aid for people, first-time home buyers, you know, all that sort of thing. But I think we're actually agreeing, but identifying two separate things. And one is that I am done critiquing the Democrats for losing when their policies are wildly popular. Even in this last election, 65% of people want abortion rights protected. 56% want undocumented immigrants to have a pathway to citizenship, and on down the line. We are looking, I think, at a country that has a systemic bias in such favor for one party that no individual Democrat can solve that imbalance any longer without a structural change so that the playing field is level again. And so one of the things that I'm playing with is, in a time in which At the national level, the Republicans appear to have a trifecta, although we don't know about the House yet, so maybe not there.
They're going to get the House.
I think so too.
Well, I'm just saying, I don't think we have that yet. How do people who are not in power restore some of those guardrails? And this is one of the reasons I'm talking about individual citizens' ability to put pressure on the media system, not on legacy media, all of them as well, but on saying these are our spaces as well, and we will not use them if they have this kind of a bias as X does. Or, we're going to take over Reddit, or we're going to take over YouTube. Because otherwise, where are the pressure points that we can restore a fair playing field for our democracy?
Liberals are terrible at that.
What's that?
Liberals are terrible at that. Think about Air America. Is it Air America?
Oh, that didn't last.
That didn't last.
Yeah.
But think about the 1890s. Think about the 1890s when we were 16 different ways screwed, right? By the robber barons, and children are working in factories and losing their arms, and there's no education, and people are throwing the sewage in the streets, and people are dying of cholera. I could go on if you want me to. But what happened then was that people started new media. They started the penny press. They started McClure's magazine. They started all sorts of different ways to communicate with people that expressed what was really happening in language that people could understand. There was a whole series in that era of there were several hundred black newspapers across the country. There were all kinds of new newspapers in the American plains that sparked the 1890 alliance movement that took over the House of Representatives and the Senate and changed the entire way we did business. So it is not impossible to say there are ways to break the stranglehold of a single party on our system.
And you mentioned before all the things that the Democrats are in favor of, that most Americans are in favor of, like affordable health care, even though, of course, Trump is obsessed with Obamacare. Guns, what is it, 80 or 90% of people think we need restrictions on guns. We're not getting those. Healthcare, abortion, as you said before. When Elizabeth Warren ran briefly, talked about how only 7% of your salary should go toward child care. That would be revolutionary, right? All these things that people want are on the Democratic side, and yet the paradox is the Republicans are talking about how they're going to rescue everybody. It's just very annoying. And when you look at a lot of the stuff on TV, this has been a criticism for years. It's the horse race, the horse race, the horse race.
And the polls.
And the polls. Yeah, how much did you hear about?
Again.
We heard some about Project 2025, but it was late into the race. You don't hear about policy very much,
No.
Well, but that's a good point. I mean, one of the things that we have seen since the election of Tuesday was a number of Democratic governors, including our own Maura Healey, saying that the states would be the loci of health care and of protections and all the things that are being denied at the federal level. And of course, having both J.B. Pritzker and Gavin Newsom on board with that really matters, because California is the 5th largest economy in the world. Right. How much of a stand will the federal government be willing to take against the 5th largest economy in the world? So, we may be looking in the United States at a new form of federalism where the states are the protection of progressive values, which I would call centrist values, rather than the reactionary ones of the past generation. And that's not unlike what happened during the turn of the last century when the robber barons were doing their thing. We got the hunkering down in Wisconsin of Robert La Follette, fighting Bob, who really became a model for the entire country.
And that horrible period that you described so graphically was followed by the progressive era.
That's right.
When we started to tackle the very issues.
I'm working on hope here. You told me to end on hope. I'm doing the best I can over here.
And we're going to invite the audience to participate with questions. So I'm really sort of delighted that you're ending on a hopeful note. When you think about the United States Congress, I mean, I covered Congress during the Reagan administration for the Globe, and I must have written the word gridlock 1,000 times. And there wasn't gridlock from the perspective of this moment. things actually got done. Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan actually talked to one another. So it was a very, very different time. But now you're going to have, if they do get the trifecta, and they've obviously got the Supreme Court, not a lot is going to get done that the Democrats can help influence. So if you're right that we should see a movement where the states pick up the slack, that's hope? Yes?
Well, yes, it's hope, but I do want to point out one of the things that is so interesting about this moment is Trump won by promising diametrically opposed things to different groups of people.
Right.
It is not possible to protect abortion in the states the way he has promised to, a certain group of people, and to put in place a national abortion ban, which is what he has promised to Project 2025 and that is in the Republican platform. It is not possible to deport a minimum of 11 million people, he's talking about as many as 20, and also protect the undocumented workers who 56% of Americans say should have a path to citizenship. Yeah. It is not possible to put tariffs on China at 60% and make goods cheaper. And you know, there are a number of places where there have been major promises that he has made that are absolutely not, you can't both have it be dry and wet at the same time.
Right.
And so if you think about how you're going to legislate that, you know, maybe, I mean, I think he's going to try and do a lot through executive orders, and we're already seeing that today.
Right.
But how can people, even if you have a majority,
right,
how are you going to legislate that?
Right. But the one cautionary note about if these initiatives do go back to the states, rights, as you pointed out, in the 1960s, we agreed that rights belong to all people.
That's right.
And so we can't have people having some rights in Mississippi or not having them in Alabama or having them in Massachusetts and not having them in Wyoming. That's not the American model, right? Well, let me open it up to our audience, who's been very patient while we've been yammering away here. I think there are microphones in both aisles. I have a little trouble seeing you, so I'm going to.
We can't see you. So.
Yeah, I don't know if we can dim the lights a little bit so we could. Or put them up.
We can see
higher.
you, sort of.
People are waving to us in the back.
Those are my students from Brandeis.
Oh, those are your students from Brandeis.
Brandeis students.
Hi.
Yes, stop waving. You'll all get an A. It's fine. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I am your online audience representative for the evening.
Could you speak up? I think we're having trouble hearing you.
Yes, apologies. I am the online audience representative for the evening, and I have 3 questions for you. We have quite a few online. Would the panelists share their thoughts about the impact of the far left in alienating the Democrats' base of working class Americans? And if there was an impact, what can the Democrats do to regain trust? Any thoughts on Massachusetts state ballot elections or any other state elections? And
I'm sorry,
we're having real trouble hearing you.
Sorry about that. Are any thoughts on Massachusetts state ballot elections or any other state elections? And what happened to the old adage that the president doesn't have much influence on the economy but gets blamed for it? Was this all foregone?
I had trouble hearing the question. I'm
afraid
sorry. I don't know.
Did you want them to address the Massachusetts ballot questions? I thought I heard that.
Oh, the ballot question.
So that's
Go
a
for that.
specific one.
Oh, okay.
Why did we get rid of the MCAS graduation requirement, Margery?
Well, we got rid of the MCAS graduation requirement because the majority of voters thought it was going to hurt, it was too stressful for kids in high school. I thought it was a bad idea, actually, to get rid of the MCAS graduation requirement because if you didn't pass it in 10th grade, you had 4 more times to pass it. And I think children that were struggling, and there were very few, 90% of the kids did pass it, would get extra help. But the Massachusetts Teachers Association really did a good job convincing people to get rid of it. I think it was a mistake, and we need some common standards right now because we don't have any. I don't know if anybody else wants to address that one.
Is that I don't know. I don't
It's
know
a
the answers.
high school
Is that no? I get what it
exit
is, but
exam.
is that frustration with how much testing has been imposed on students since No Child Left Behind?
Yeah.
I think
Yes.
so, but I'm old enough to remember when
It
you would
was just
graduate
MCAS.
from high school and not be able to read and write well enough to function, and that's hard. You don't want to go through life like that.
Did you know? I just looked up the statistics yesterday. 54% of Americans read at or below a 6th grade level. Yeah, I
Well,
know.
that could
I thought-
explain the election result.
I didn't think it was. I thought somebody said that to me, and I was like, no way. And I looked it up, and I was like, crap, that's right.
Look, get these folks.
I have a very easy question. 4 years from now, will the people who voted for Trump realize they made a mistake and said, oh gosh darn, I made a mistake?
Go ahead.
You know, I think that there are many. Here's my answer to this, I guess. When Berlusconi left the office in Italy, he had a steady 25% support. No matter what else happened, 25% of the people supported him. And now I was just reading in something the other day where someone said nobody will admit ever to have been being a Berlusconi voter. So apparently he had 0% support, even though, no, he had 25%. You know, I think that we're looking at a very low moment in American politics, and I don't think anybody will ever come up to you and say, you were right, you were right, you were right. But I think that there will come a time when nobody will admit that they were a Trump voter.
The gentleman here.
So I spent about 150 hours doing phone banking for different nonprofits and for the campaign directly during this campaign. And I totally agree that misinformation was one of the major forces that lost Kamala the election. And the other one that I saw that was a major force was there were a lot of people I talked to who said, I hate Trump, I can't stand him, but I'm going to vote for him because he's sent to us by God. And I'd have a conversation with them and I'd talk to them about that. And what it came down to is that the head of their church, whoever that was, whatever parish or whatever it was, had essentially told them, vote for him, he's our messenger. That was a huge, massive force. I ran into a lot of people who had that. And so, separate from that, I have two questions. One of the things that's really important to me, rather than looking back, is to look forward. And there's millions of people who are about to get their lives totally screwed by this deportation thing. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I would like, Margery, for you to do on your show is elicit creativity from people out there in the public on how to reduce the harm and prevent the worst things from happening. Because I think there are a lot of people who have ideas, and right now everybody's just standing there shaking in their boots and thinking, well, I can't do anything. But it isn't true. There's a lot of us who can do something. And question for you, Heather, where I ran into enormous ignorance, I kept having this thought to myself, is it the fact that we've been in such peace and prosperity for so long in this country that allows people to be so ignorant about what's going on? Historically, do you find that when things do turn around, like you just mentioned a minute ago, is it because people are feeling pain and they start to educate themselves better and they start to realize what's going on? Or am I just imagining that? Because it looks like that to me.
No, I think that's right. I think, many people don't imagine that we could lose everything, and we can. Because the guardrails have been there for 2 generations, and people believe they always will be there. And again, in the past, I have a long theory about it that we probably don't have time to go into, but the way that politics works is that if things are going pretty well, people keep their mouths shut. Now, a few people are unhappy, but they don't know each other because there's out of this whole room, 2 of you are unhappy. But then more and more people start to be unhappy, and they start to articulate that they are unhappy. And they start to look for people to represent them and at higher levels to say they are unhappy. And one of the things that I think makes the stories we tell so crucial is that it's really the way that people understand their unhappiness that will affect the way that their leaders behave. And so, it's one of the reasons I do what I do, is I think the storytellers in our society really matter. And once there is a story that other people can say, hey, I'm not that happy either, that they can follow, they will change politics.
Interesting.
I want to suggest as an additional variable that goes into disinformation, which is the fact that probably almost all disinformation is focused on frightening people, and frightening people who feel diminished and disregarded by the rest of us. And I don't know how we address that as a nation. I mean, some of it perhaps is a lack of education and the inability to think critically, but I'm terribly concerned about how much we are fear-driven. So many folks are driven by fear rather than facts, and want you to tell me how to fix it.
You can fear things that are not other people. I think you redirect fear personally. You don't have to fear other people. You can fear, what LBJ tried to do was talk about fearing poverty, right? That it is possible to create the space to take advantage of that primal fear without turning it against other people. You can turn it to some other space, poverty, inequality. There are ways to direct it.
And how do we do that?
Narrative.
Yeah. Narrative, you said that the stories that we tell matter so much, but look at what happened across the country, all those women who told the stories of having a miscarriage and being unable to get medical care.
But if those stories had made it through the right-wing media bubble, would they have made a difference? Look at every state that's had an abortion protection to be written into the Constitution has passed, except Florida, but that's because their threshold was 60, which is very high.
But it was interesting how those same women, or not women, everyone who voted for those abortion protections, so many of them then voted for the guy who put the 3 people on the Supreme Court who took away Roe. It was an interesting...
Or again, we'll have to look at the numbers when they really come out, or those were one-issue voters, the people who showed up and voted for Trump and went home again.
Right.
But one thing about all the ads about the miscarriages and the wanted babies and stuff, I heard this on a podcast this morning. Kate Cernke used to work for the Globe, said this on the Daily, the podcast, that they were all couched as women who had tragedies, who wanted babies, and they had a miscarriage or fetal abnormality or whatever. It wasn't couched in the way of, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who said, without reproductive freedom, women have no economic freedom. It wasn't seen about women having autonomy. It was women in tragedy, which I thought was kind of an interesting way.
Including their husbands.
Yeah.
It was all about family.
That's right.
It was a rewriting of
Because that was the only way you could sell it.
That's right. That's right.
This gentleman.
Hi there. As somebody who is a member of Gen Z, I understand the comments made tonight about lack of media literacy and civics. But as a member of Gen Z, and I think I speak for a lot of Gen Z, we're not afraid, we're angry. And we're angry, and as Professor Richardson pointed out, we're angry with Gen X, our parents' generation, because they're the ones who went the most for Trump. And your point about the past, about Reagan and Tip O'Neill working together, that's true. But we say that Trump isn't part of our country. Well, President Reagan ignored the AIDS crisis until Rock Hudson got AIDS, while millions of people died. President George W. Bush ignored the city of New Orleans when it was wiped off the map in 2005. So I think Gen Z is angry at Gen X for failure, for telling us that we need to be personally responsible, that lying is bad, that all these things are wrong when they do these things and promote them themselves. We're tired of the hypocrisy from older generations telling us that we shouldn't do these things when they're promoting them themselves. So my question for you is, do you really believe that Donald Trump is an aberration, or is he just a development of things that have come before him? where we have been with the hatred towards the LGBTQ community from the Republican Party for 35 years. You know, are these trans ads, the trans ads that you mentioned, are they really an aberration, or is this just a continuation of the hatred from the 80s and 90s? I mean, is this really just a blip, or is this something that the Republican Party has been fostering for a long time?
Well, you're the historian, you take that one.
So you know my answer to this, right? That Reagan, that he's a continuation of a long thing. But
That's all of our answers to this.
I hope I'm not out of line here. This is one of my best students ever. So it's lovely to see you.
It's good to see you tonight as well.
Yeah, so I think it's a continuation of this deliberate attempt to divide the population. What do you think? He knows what I think.
Go ahead, Eileen.
I absolutely agree with you. Except, you know, with a few caveats. Yes, he's not an aberration. We can understand if we look back. I mean, Richard Nixon's Southern strategy was just as ugly as the kind of hate-filled rhetoric that we hear from Donald Trump. He was politer in it. We had a governor of Massachusetts, who you'll remember, Eddie King, who had a political consultant who said he knew the prescription for how to win elections in America. You take all the hate groups, you put them in a pot, and you stir. And it works. It works. So no, I don't think he's anything new, but John Meacham had a wonderful column the other day in the New York Times, the American historian, who said, I've made the mistake with Donald Trump of thinking he's in the tradition of Joe McCarthy and George Wallace, and he really's not. He's a piece of those things, but what we're seeing in him, none of those men made it to the White House. He's really done what that political consultant suggested, putting the hate groups in a pot, stirring, and making a stew that was palatable to enough people that he's now been elected president twice. So you are right about Ronald Reagan's ignoring the AIDS crisis. You're right about George Bush, but you're able to identify particular failings of these particular presidents. Donald Trump's whole philosophy is to dehumanize the people of New Orleans and the people that we all know and loved who died of AIDS. So that's a different kettle of fish from where I sit.
I'm just hoping it doesn't get any worse than this. I mean, this guy, I can't think of many redeeming qualities at all in Donald Trump. So, God, I hope he's at the extreme end of a trajectory or something. I mean, what?
I don't know if that satisfied you as an answer.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Sir.
Well, first off, as a member of Gen X, I'm hoping we can start to rebuild for Gen Z and the following generations. My question is, and we've hit on it a couple of times, is, you know, you've spoken about new media pressure, you've spoken about stirring the pot of hate. And with Democrats, the issue has become that we're expected to play by a certain set of rules, and Republicans are allowed to ignore them. And so how do we change that narrative, and how do we approach, beyond just with the new media pressure, how do we hit the legacy media? How do we hit all of these other ways where we're going, you know, in a way it's like, well, a Democrat can't do this. And I'm sorry, now that I'm at the mic, I'm blanking on the Kamala example that I was trying to think of, but you guys had brought it up with trans rights already, where this is a policy that started under Trump, yet he made it a talking point against Kamala. So what do we do to fight back against that? Why is the expectation? Because the expectation is, hey, we need to play by the rules. And then when we play by the rules, it becomes, oh, well, you're standing above. You're being elitist. You know, how do we combat that? And then a second point that I do want to make, I know we've spoken a lot about education levels, but I have to tell you, I know a lot of educated people who voted for Trump.
Sure.
And who had the very clear misconception of what Kamala was. I had people straight up who had master's degrees in business and economics tell me that Kamala was unqualified and Trump was. So, I'm sorry to just throw all that out.
Well, she's a black woman. I'm sorry, I don't want to beat the drum too much, but I think obviously you saw that debate between the two of them. She's a very sophisticated thinker and brilliant woman, and she was certainly qualified to be the
Remember
more
when
qualified.
Trump was going on about, would you rather get electrocuted by the motor or eaten by the shark? Remember that whole thing he did? You think, what is he talking about?
Right.
And that was, I guess, okay. And I don't know what you think, but Trump is probably going to pardon all the January 6th rioters, including the guy from the Proud Boys, get 22 years. And in terms of breaking the rules, well, Biden has said he wouldn't pardon his son.
Right.
I don't know, if I was Biden,
I'd pardon my son.
I'd pardon my son in
I
2
think on
seconds.
his way out the door, he should pardon his
and
son.
break the rules, and who cares? I mean, he's going to...
Well, we all listened to Michelle Obama when she said, when they go low, we go high.
Oh,
Right.
not anymore, though.
No, it doesn't,
Yeah.
because it doesn't
Let's
work.
go low. Let's go
It doesn't
low.
work, but you also have to decide just how much of your soul you're willing to sell.
Well, so that's actually a really wonderful question, I think, because there is the recognition that if you are trying to reinforce democratic values, you must honor those democratic values. And this is really proven if you look at the ways in which East Germany and West Germany responded to World War II. You know, West Germany ended up letting some Nazis go, but they kept reinforcing the systems of democracy. East Germany got all the Nazis, but they trampled on democracy, and you know where that went. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about Kamala Harris and the way she handled that debate was she murdered him as with the same terms of a world of the wrestling world that he had always used. She beat him psychologically, and that was actually really important. And one of the things that you've seen in this last Congress is the Democrats in the minority in the House slaughtering the Republicans. So I'm thinking of Jasmine Crockett from Florida, for example, another incredibly brilliant woman, but when she wants to code switch and turn into just vicious, she does, and she gets a lot of eyeballs when she does it. Jared Moskowitz, also from Florida, the same thing. And that changing approach to politics on the part of the Democrats that says, screw you, we're going to come back at you the same way you came at us, and we're smarter than you, which is what Moskowitz keeps doing. I mean, it's just, and Jamie Raskin, another really powerful voice
Brilliant
there.
voice, yeah.
Now, the reason that I mention that, and the reason I think it's really significant, is that, you know, this is very similar to what happened in the 1850s when the Southerners were carrying guns and blustering and fighting on the floor of Congress and all that, and the Northerners kept saying, we're not going to fight you, we want to get along, we're not going to fight you, until Preston Brooks beat Charles Sumner from Massachusetts almost to death on the floor of the Senate. And all the Democratic senators stood around and watched. And after that happened, a representative from Massachusetts, Anson Burlingame, stood up in the House and he said, we will fight you. And everyone was like, oh, you can't do that, you can't talk that way. And he's like, screw you, you've been doing this forever, we will fight you. And he challenged Preston Brooks to a duel. And he, you know, this is a big deal at the time. He challenged Preston Brooks to a duel, and Brooks is like, you know, the reason he had the cane is because he'd gotten a bullet in his leg from a previous duel. And then of course, theoretically they were supposed to do it, and Anson Burlingame was a sharpshooter in a day when almost nobody was a sharpshooter, and he said, let's use rifles. And then Preston Brooks is like, oh, this is sounding worse by the minute. And then he said, and let's do it in Canada, since it's illegal in the United States, which meant that Preston Brooks was going to have to cross all the way across the north to get to Canada to have this duel. And of course, Preston Brooks is like, I think I'm good. And then he made fun of him as a coward from then on. And that became the reason that Anson Burlingame becomes a fairly major figure in 19th century politics. And there's a lot that comes from that. But it was a really important moment when people who had said, oh, come on, let's negotiate, let's get along, finally said, we're done, we will fight. And while you don't remember Anson Burlingame now, that was a key moment in the stepping up, and that was in 1856, in the stepping up of Northerners to say, we are not playing your game any longer. This is our country too.
Okay, great. Ma'am.
Start again.
There you go.
I feel like this is my country too. I am a naturalized citizen. I am a privileged naturalized citizen. And I worry every day about the less privileged immigrants to this country and the damage, not just from a humanities standpoint, but from an economic standpoint. But today, I read that Stephen Miller said, yes, we started a new denaturalization project under Trump. In 2025, expect to see it turbocharged. So are they, because we would be easy to find, those of us who are naturalized. We don't live under the radar like a lot of our undocumented. So is it reasonable to expect they'll come after us too?
I don't think so. I don't think that you're his target. I think what we all have to worry about is undocumented workers. I mean, I'm not sure that this mass deportation that he's promising is really going to happen, because, you know, the people who own all those farms in California are going to be a little disturbed when all their workforce is deported to Mexico. And all those people that voted for Trump who were bitching about the price of eggs, wait till they see what a head of lettuce is going to cost them when there's nobody there to pick them. Do you see?
Well, I think it's significant that one of the things that Trump has repeatedly said is we will send troops to blue state cities. Because the obvious place to start if you really want to throw a whole bunch of people out of the country is in Florida and Texas. And they're not talking about Florida and Texas because that would devastate those economies. So, should you be frightened? Should anybody who is an undocumented or even a naturalized citizen be frightened? I would say we should all be frightened, because what the plan, I think, will be is to create immediately after the inauguration a very visible, very cruel, very fast, dramatic, made-for-TV moment. And it will, the way that we shape our world before that and during that will say a lot about what happens next. And that's the job, I think, as people said, of figuring out how to take care of the Americans who are here, undocumented or otherwise. So, is it going to be possible to do what he says? I don't think so. Mm-hmm. But is there potential to cause one hell of a lot of damage, not only to migrants, but also to political opponents, to journalists, to intellectuals, to all the people that fascist governments usually go after first? Absolutely. And that's going to include a lot of people.
Thank you. Thank you. Sir.
Hello. Mic on?
Yeah.
First, I'm a baby boomer. I hope that doesn't disqualify me.
I think there's a couple up here.
Yeah, that's right. We're all here.
I won't speak for Margery, but...
As I'm waiting online, I keep adding to the question, which is not good. I believe it was Mark Twain who said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think you mentioned Mussolini as I was in the line here, or his percentage when he left. Did he?
Berlusconi.
My question, which isn't,
Yeah.
but do we have any trains that we have to worry about running on time? Okay. My question is, about creating scapegoats because of dislocation. Back after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, they say, was so cruel and bad, it caused dislocation to the economy and then created scapegoats. My question is, did COVID create a scapegoat, albeit that Trump exacerbated it? Are we in a state of dislocation because of COVID that caused people like the gentleman who said before, people with master's degrees to vote for Trump because they still feel dislocated because of COVID? By the way, I think history will show that Woodrow Wilson, when the Spanish flu came about, basically had the same mental block about the Spanish flu. World War I came along and he didn't have to address it. But my question is, does dislocation bring about authoritarianism?
I don't know. We all look stumped.
Yeah. You're the historian.
The historian.
Well,
We turn to the
We'll turn to
historian.
you.
Since woman said she didn't understand dislocation, they said in Germany in the 20s you had to bring a barrel of money to buy a loaf of bread.
Because
that
of
was
inflation,
dislocation.
yeah, right.
And it created, okay, fine, we can get up. And the, I lost my train of thought. The
Right.
dislocation.
Whether social dislocation creates this kind of rise of
Right.
authoritarianism.
I mean, people search for an answer and they go to authoritarians to do it. And that's that. And I think the country faced a lot of dislocation. Schools were closed, businesses were closed, business went out of business.
We're gonna let her try to answer, if you don't mind. I don't want to interrupt you, but our time is getting short. So,
Scholars of authoritarianism always say that in order to create a population that is ripe for the rise of authoritarianism, you need to create a population or find a population that has been dislocated either socially, culturally, economically, or religiously. They're the groundwork. And this is Hannah Arendt writes a lot about this, but my favorite is Eric Hoffer, who writes in 1951. He's a longshoreman in San Francisco. And everybody was busily asking where Mussolini and Hitler had come from, and he said, who cares? Because we don't care where they came from, because every generation has Hitlers and Mussolinis. The question is, why do people follow them at certain times? And he said, you get people who are dislocated like this, they feel like they have lost the modern world, and they are susceptible to a leader who will say to them, I can get you back to a world in which you felt like you were important, so long as you support me, and the people who are causing your distress are those people. And who those people are does not matter. They are used only to solidify people around a rising authoritarian. And if that's the case, COVID maybe. I think you could make an argument that COVID actually increased American sense of community and belonging because we started to use social media to erase longer distances. But I would argue that since 1981, the United States has created a badly dislocated population economically with that transfer of the $53 trillion from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. And from that, you have been able to tell those people, your life would be great if only we got rid of those people. So maybe.
I hate to wrap it up, because we could go on forever.
No, we have to end on a cheerful
We have to end on a cheerful note. So does somebody have this? We're going to have to take one question.
You don't have a cheerful question.
One question.
Hi, Professor McNamara.
Hi. My student.
I woke up on Wednesday, November 6th, and I cried. I turned 21 in March. I am a queer woman of color. My mom's parents immigrated to Brookline, Massachusetts 50 years ago, and I was born and raised in Brookline. One happy note is that the Celtics are up. Anyways, Banner 19. My question, as someone who interned at the state politics level this past summer, is what can local politics do to block Trump, and what power do local politics have in this moment?
That's a great question.
That's good for you. Go.
You know,
Thank you, Randy. Good question.
We had Mayor Michelle Wu on the radio today, and she was talking about how, as Governor Healy has said, there's not going to be a law enforcement apparatus, the state police, local police. They're not going to be participating in any roundup of any people who are here without documentation. Maura Healey sued Trump about, 90 times when she was the Attorney General. Yeah. Andrea Campbell will do those sorts of things, the Attorney General here. So I think we have, interestingly, just like the people who stood up to Trump have been women, we have 3 women here in Wu and Healy and Campbell that I think are going to do everything they can in Massachusetts and Boston to protect people. So that's encouraging, I think.
That's a hopeful note on which to end. On behalf of my fellow colleagues here, I want to thank you all for coming out on a chilly night. It was wonderful, and your questions were terrific. We could talk all night, obviously, but in fact, we can't. Thank you. That way, okay?
Yeah. I'll call you,
I think you want to
okay? And you're going to wait for me.